Alright, the topic for part 12 is, can there be agreement as to what constitutes human death? You might think this is a fairly straightforward matter, but as the opening examples in the chapter illustrate, sometimes people have been thought to be dead by those around them who love and care for them, and it turns out they really weren't dead. But even apart from those cases of mistaken death that end up in a burial or something terrible like that, there's important issues about human death and when to define it that come into play with organ donation. Because in the United States and many other places in the world, there is such a thing as a dead donor rule that says you cannot take vital organs from an organism unless that organism is dead. Now, the point that they start with, that many have held that death occurs when there is a permanent cessation of all biological functions of an organism, is sometimes known as a systemic view of death. Now, a different view is that one of the criteria for determining death from the United States Uniform Determination of Death Act back in 1981 is an irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. This is known as the cardiopulmonary view of death. A third view we'll look at in just a moment, but in order to think about these views, you might benefit from carefully looking over the part of the introduction that deals with the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. Here's the quick rundown. A necessary condition refers to a condition whereby, given A or B, to say that A is a necessary condition for B is to say that it is impossible to have B without A. However, a sufficient condition refers to a state of affairs or a condition whereby, given A and B, to say that A is a sufficient condition for B is to say that if A is the case, then B must also be the case. Combining these, a complete and accurate explanation will be understood in terms of meeting both necessary and sufficient conditions. This is sometimes talked about as a biconditional relationship, which can be expressed as claim X if and only if claim Y. So, we can apply what we know about these necessary and sufficient conditions to the definition of and conditions for death. The first example that we'll take a look at is the systemic view, the second is the whole brain view, a third is the higher brain view, and the fourth is what's called the lower brain view. So, back to the systemic view of death, noted above. Some organism is dead if and only if there's a permanent cessation of all biological functions of an organism. And of course, if someone comes back to life, or if someone basically is buried in a coffin and then comes out of the coffin, then in this definition, they weren't permanently stopped with their biological functions, so they weren't dead to begin with. Now, they point out how, especially since the emergence of various technologies like ventilating machines, along with some influential discoveries in neuroscience, the thought about what constitutes death has kind of shifted away from the traditional cardiopulmonary function views, and especially just views that focus on cardiac death, and it has shifted towards views that emphasize some role of the whole brain or part of the brain. And so, according to the whole brain view of human death, one is considered dead if and only if the entire brain permanently ceases to function. According to the higher brain view of human death, one is considered dead if and only if the higher parts of the brain, responsible for consciousness, like self-awareness, subjective experience, located in this part of the brain called the neocortex, only if those parts permanently cease to function. And then according to the brainstem view of human death, sometimes also called the lower brain view, one is considered dead if and only if there is the permanent cessation of brainstem function, which includes, as they point out, basic autonomic functions like respiration, body temp regulation, and the control of heartbeat, waking, and sleep. So, in order to understand some of these, especially higher brain and brainstem/lower brain views of death, it's necessary to quickly go over the parts of the human brain. And here I've summarized what they talk about on one of the pages in your book. The human brain can be looked at as a three-part brain, one part being the neocortex, consisting of the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres, these are responsible for more of the distinctively human forms of consciousness that we have. Second is called the limbic system, found in all mammals. It's often called the paleomammalian cortex. It consists of the thalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. And the third part would be the brainstem core, found not only in humans and in other mammals, but in reptiles as well. Here we've got the base of the human brain, and it consists of the brain stem, the reticular formation, and the striate cortex. Now, the whole brain standard of death that we looked at earlier has been accepted as public policy by most governments of the world. Okay, this includes the death of the brainstem core, the neomammalian cortex, and the neocortex. However, most states in the United States follow the definition of death that I looked at earlier in the Uniform Determination of Death Act from 1981. Now, the UDDA makes whole brain death only one of two criteria. Here's the quote from your book from the Uniform Determination of Death Act. An individual who has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. So on UDDA, you can meet one of these criteria but not the other and still count as dead. What about the higher brain standard? This is much more controversial, probably due to the fact that they point out that even with a higher brain death, or so-called death, the lower parts of the brain are still functioning. And so there's still basic bodily functions like a beating heart and reflex behaviors, even though the higher brain is still unusable, perhaps permanently unusable. So, the first author in our section, named James Burnett, holds to the whole brain standard. Here's a quote from Burnett: "The irreversible cessation of brain functions serves as a criterion of death because it is a necessary and sufficient condition for the cessation of the organism as a whole." And the second author in this section, named Winston Chung, thinks that it's misguided to place so much emphasis on defining death. Chung says there is no essential feature, there's no silver bullet that gives you the necessary and sufficient conditions for death. You're going to have to be satisfied with something that says, look, in some cases, death might have higher brain cessation. In other cases, death might have whole brain cessation. And it's a mistake, he thinks, to try to isolate one or two or three of these conditions as making up the necessary and sufficient conditions for death.